Footsteps crunched through the dusty Cuban heat. Stephen had only been a prison guard at Guantanamo Bay Naval Detention Center for a few months, which is why he was proud to have received already the most important assignment on base: a member of the personal guard detail for Detainee 760, who he was told was the most dangerous and valuable prisoner that the United States had ever captured. So valuable, in fact, that he was held in his own cell in his own personal trailer, a trailer known only by its designation, Echo Special. And as Stephen approached Echo Special, he couldn't help but feel trepidation. He had seen horrible things in his time at Gitmo, and he couldn't imagine how bad Detainee 760 must be to warrant all this extra security. As he entered the outer layer of the cell, the duty guard issued him with a Halloween mask and black electrical tape to go over his name tag, both instruments to protect his identity from this most dangerous of terrorists. The cell door swung wide, and what Stephen saw wasn't the dangerous bomb-building 9/11 plotting terrorist that he had expected. He saw a slight, well-kept man sitting on a concrete block that 760 called a bed. The man stood, clearly nervous, and approached Stephen, hand outstretched. Bemused, Stephen shook it, and the man said in perfect English, "My name is Mohamedou Salahi." "Sup, dude?" The story of Mohamedou Salahi is exemplary of the United States reaction to war on terror. A vast overreaction that has destroyed civil liberties and infringed on the constitutional rights of millions of people, non-citizens and citizens of the United States alike. Because Mohamedou Salahi was entirely innocent, but he was swept up in a sweep in Mauritania following 9/11 and held in Guantanamo Bay, where he was tortured into giving confessions that warranted holding him for a full 14 years prior to his release in 2016, when the United States government acknowledged that he was innocent. Now, our response to 9/11 was an overreaction, and the story of Mohamedou Salahi is not at all unique. There were hundreds of prisoners like him in Guantanamo Bay, as well as CIA black sites across the world. But the prisoners held in Gitmo and elsewhere were only the beginning of the infringements of civil liberties that occurred following 9/11. I would categorize these infringements in three categories. First, broad surveillance. Second, indefinite detention. And third, enhanced interrogation. It's critical, in a time when we are at a historic moment with a pandemic ravaging the world, that we not lose sight of the bigger picture. We not lose sight of our constitutional rights and our civil liberties. And that's why it's critical that as citizens of the United States, we take this time to take a step back, evaluate what we have done over the past 2 decades, and decide how we want to move forward. So today, let's investigate precisely what we've done in those three categories, and then evaluate our solutions. First, broad surveillance. Quote, "The pictures of airplanes flying in buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger." End quote. That quote comes from President George W. Bush in his address to the nation from the Oval Office the night of September 11th, 2001. And his statements about anger would prove to be prophetic, because in the next few months, the United States would turn into a raging bull. Just 40 days later, on October 26, 2001, lawmakers passed and President Bush signed in that same seat at the Resolute desk the USA Patriot Act, less commonly known as the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. But we have to look at the Patriot Act as more than an awful acronym. Because the fact of the matter is that the Patriot Act has infringed on civil liberties for years, and in the form of the USA Freedom Act, continues to do so. And the most prominent way that it has done that is through a provision called Section 215, which, according to investigative reporting by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has allowed the government for the past 2 decades to collect the phone records of United States citizens. Now, let's be clear, these aren't the contents of the phone calls that citizens are making to each other, although those contents can be collected on calls between United States citizens and foreign nationals. No, these are just the phone records. So they would know if you called, say, a pizza place to order a pepperoni pizza and at what time you did it, and then when you called again to confirm receipt of the order. But these phone records are incredibly powerful, and a federal judge has already ruled them to be constitutional. That judge did so in 2015, but then lawmakers made an end run around the court order ordering Section 215 collections to be shut down, according to reporting by the New York Times. Instead, only a month after that court order, lawmakers in Congress passed the USA Freedom Act, the spiritual successor to the Patriot Act, which has allowed those same lawmakers and the United States intelligence community to continue to suppress our rights under the First and Fourth Amendments according to the American Civil Liberties Union. Because all that the Freedom Act really did was ensure that there would be more safeguards on how that data was collected and the databases that it would be stored in. It didn't affect anything about the collection of the data itself or the kinds of data that could be collected. And Section 215 is only one blatant example. There are dozens of surveillance programs authorized through the Patriot Act, things like PRISM, X-Keyscore, Mystic, and Stonehenge, all programs that you probably have a good idea of, but they amount, in whole, to allowing the government to spy on citizens, which, again according to the American Civil Liberties Union, is suppressing our Fourth Amendment rights, our rights to unreasonable search and seizure. In other words, the rights to have our information not be searched by a tyrannical government. 2. Indefinite detention. Quote, "In the dark halls of Abu Ghraib and the detention cells of Guantanamo, we have compromised our most precious values." That quote comes from then President-elect Barack Obama, when he was on the campaign trail prior to his first election in 2008. And it was possibly one of the most correct things that he ever said on that campaign trail, but it was also one of his biggest policy failures while in office. Because Mr. Obama promised numerous times to shut down Guantanamo Bay and other black site prisons around the world, but he was never able to do so. And understandably so, because there are extensive logistics problems involved. But that doesn't change the fact that indefinite detention is ongoing to this day, and not just of suspected terrorists. In fact, according to reporting by The Intercept, most indefinite detention is categorized under the 2001 Authorization of Use of Military Force, which was essentially Congress's way of passing a law that would allow us to officially declare war in the war on terror. However, according to Human Rights Watch, 731 of the 780 known prisoners held under the 2001 Authorization of Use of Military Force have already been found innocent. But it's still in use to this day. But that's not all. Because according to reporting by the American Civil Liberties Union, Section 412 of the USA Patriot Act, while being lesser known than some of its more controversial counterparts, is a provision that allows the government to detain practically anyone, and it has seen recent use for the first time in history. Because in November of 2019, under the Trump administration, the first detention under Section 412 was held underway. And it was a detention of a legal resident of the United States who had been living in the country for years, who was swept up in Immigrations and Customs Enforcement new deportation measures under the Trump administration. And the Trump administration used Section 412 to justify that indefinite detention, meaning that this man, who was a lawful resident of the United States, is currently being held in indefinite detention, which is contradictory to his constitutional rights, which guarantee him a quick and speedy trial. But that's not all, because there's a new law passed under the Obama administration known as the NDAA that allows the executive branch, should they so choose, to detain any citizen they want, any United States citizen, according to reporting by The Guardian. What that means is that the executive branch, which includes the Department of Justice, effectively have the ability to detain whoever they want and hold them indefinitely, contradictory to their own constitutional rights. This is an injustice that needs to be corrected, not just for the people living in Guantanamo Bay, but for the citizens who, in the very near future, could be detained for whatever reason the government wants without the right to a fair trial, contradictory to the principles that this country was founded upon. But it's time for us to move on to the most grievous civil liberties violation of them all: enhanced interrogation. Quote, "This is one of the most fundamental norms of international law, and its violation is among the most serious crimes." End quote. And that quote is attributed to Nils Melzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. But the fact of the matter is that most serious of crimes is still being committed by the United States today. Because, according to an executive summary that was 700 pages of a 7,000-page Senate report summarizing CIA torture programs following 9/11, the United States committed torture on over 100 prisoners. But that's not all, because that same report found that according to the interrogators, the torturers, the torture was not an effective means of extracting useful information from prisoners, and in fact, any confessions rendered under that torture are inadmissible. Furthermore, torture is still ongoing, because according to a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture's Office report, there have been reports, admittedly unconfirmed, only alleged reports, that torture activities, that is, activities that fall under the definition of torture, are still ongoing at Guantanamo Bay today. But finally, let's discuss citizen action, what we can do. The fact of the matter is, enhanced interrogation, indefinite detention, and broad surveillance are all problems that are still underway today, but we can fix them if we only try. First, we can release the full report, the 7,000-page Senate report on CIA torture that had an executive summary consisting of only a less detailed 700 pages released in 2014. We can release the full report and move to prosecute those implicated in the report as committing torture, which is defined as a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, a treaty that the United States is party to. Next, we can repeal the laws and give fair trial to those currently being held under indefinite detention. And finally, we can repeal the Patriot Act, which, in the words of Edward Snowden, has effectively allowed the United States intelligence community to hold a gun to the head of its citizens with the use of its mass surveillance capabilities, with only the assurance, "Don't worry, I won't shoot. Trust me." These are all still ongoing problems, but they are problems that can be solved. And we are at a crucial turning point in history, and we need to take the time to consider precisely what we need to do. We need to take the time to consider the most important question of all for all United States citizens. In the words of Roman poet Juvenal, Quis custodiae ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guards themselves? Who will watch the watchers?